Bobby. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome everyone, and thanks very much for joining us tonight. My name is Keith McNamara and I'm Deputy Director for Housing and Environment within Perth and Kinross Council. I'm delighted to welcome residents of Kinross as well as elected members into this forum tonight. We also have representatives from the following organisations: Perth and Kinross, Scottish Flood Forum and Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. We're here tonight to talk about the significant storm and flooding events of 11th and 12th of August, which impacted on many areas of Scotland and particularly in Perth and Kinross, where we experienced multiple instances of flooding throughout our area. This resulted from what has been reported as a month and a half's rainfall occurring in 6 hours. So we're here tonight to learn about what happened and why, and also what we can do together to minimise the impact of any future flooding event. In saying what I said, I realised that the storm was significant, and although saying that just helped those affected, recognition of suffering in the long-term process of recovery is really important, and that's why it's so important to hold these meetings. We are living in difficult and challenging times, and this is reflected in the way that we're having to conduct this meeting tonight. Usually these types of meetings would be held face-to-face, however social distancing prevents us from doing so. So this is, I think it must be about the 8th meeting we've had in a series of meetings. So we're kind of getting used to the system, and it's my job to hopefully guide you through this different style of meeting to what we're accustomed to. So if you may indulge me, I'm not planning to introduce everyone on the call tonight, as that would take up a substantial part of your time. And what we do in time-honoured fashion is that anyone who responds to a comment or a question will usually introduce themselves just at the start of the response, so you know who's speaking. We're going to start with a short presentation, followed by a discussion in relation to any comments or questions that you want to raise, either because your point maybe wasn't explained or covered in the presentation, or because you want to follow up on anything that was said in the presentation. There's one difference, I guess, to a normal meeting where usually people have to wait until the very end before they put in their comments or questions. But because we are doing this through a chat box at the side, then the minute you think of a question or a comment, please feel free to put it in and we will respond at the end of the session. So while something's fresh in your head, just go for that. This is a stage at which I'll hand over to my colleague Bobby, who's just going to talk you through how to do the questions and comments section. So over to yourself, Bobby.
Hi everyone. If you're looking to put a question to be answered, you'll see that there's a little box with a question mark on it. If you just click on that, you can type any questions or any statements that you want to make, and we should get round to getting to all of these as we go through the course of the night. Thank you.
Cheers, Bobby. One further advantage of doing this meeting by remote means, by electronic means, is that the meeting does get recorded, and that will then be put on YouTube, so people who couldn't make the meeting tonight can tune into the meeting, and also the questions and answers which are put into the chat box are maintained and they are distributed as well, so there's quite a comprehensive record of the meeting tonight. Because the meeting is recorded, when people are making comments or questions and I'm inviting colleagues to give an answer to it, I will be repeating what the question is, just so that it's recorded on the video as opposed to the written word. So that's why I'm perhaps repeating back some of the questions that you're answered. So this is the kind of a point of the engagement. It's a start of the engagement, but absolutely it's not the end of the engagement. And if anyone wants a one-to-one conversation after this, whether it be with council colleagues, other public services or the Scottish Flood Forum, we're more than happy to accommodate that. So I'll lead on to the presentation and hand over to my colleague Peter Dixon to take you through the presentation. Thank you.
Great stuff, thanks Keith. I'm Peter Dixon, I'm the Senior Engineer with the Council's flooding team. I'm just going to take you through a short presentation, folks. It's really just 2 slides. The first one, as you can see now on your screens, hopefully, is just the initial overview of the storm that happened on the 11th and 12th of August, and a little bit about the operational response from the council and the emergency services. So just to talk about the storm itself, during the night of 11th of August, much of Scotland was affected by significant thunderstorms and heavy rainfall. The entire Perth and Kinross Council area suffered extensive rainfall, thunder and lightning for 6 hours from around 11 p.m. on the 11th of August. The flooding is understood to have affected approximately 200 properties in some parts of Perth, as well as Alyth, Kinross, Dunning, Pitlochry and other communities. In Perth itself, the Met Office confirmed that the majority of the rain came between midnight and 3 a.m, with 43.4 millimetres falling between 1 and 2 a.m. And the total rainfall in Perth was 86.4 millimetres for the 24-hour period from 6 a.m. on the 11th to 6 a.m. on the 12th of August. Met Office climate data indicates that Perth would normally experience an average of 88.8 millimetres of rain in the whole month of August. 43 millimetres in an hour is therefore exceptional and confirms that the storm was significant, and initial rainfall analysis by SEPA has confirmed this. In terms of Kinross, the nearest rain gauge is at a place called Lathrow. That gauge recorded maximum rainfall levels of 21.4 millimetres in a 1 hour period, 29.2 millimetres over 3 hours and 57.2 millimetres over 12 hours. Now, the average monthly rainfall for August in Kinross is 87 millimetres, so roughly 2/3 of the average rainfall for August fell in a 12-hour period. Flooding impacts were experienced across a widespread area, central and northeast Scotland, and SEPA are preparing a comprehensive report of the event, which will be published when complete. So just move on just to talk a little bit more locally about the flood mechanism in the South Kinross area and what happened in there. In South Kinross, the main source of flood risk is from the 3 local watercourses, the South Quaich and the Gelly Burn, which flows into the Quaich, and also a much smaller watercourse which flows past the Mire Park, known as the Clashburn. And on 12th of August, the South Quaich rose up to a level of 1.836 metres, and that was at the SEPA river gauge, according to the gauge data on SEPA's website. Now, that was marginally lower than occurred on the 22nd of February this year, when we had a higher level of 1.842 metres. And the February gauge height that recorded then was the highest on records, and those records started back in 1992. So we've had 2 pretty significant events this year. On 12th of August, water spilled out over the banks of the South Quaich on the west side, resulting in floodwaters affecting properties in Quaich Place, Old Cleash Road, High Street and Smith Street. Approximately 10 properties were affected, 2 of those being flooded internally above floor level, with other properties having floodwater into their solums and flood their gardens and affecting outbuildings. Businesses along both sides of the South Quaich flooded, some internally and some in their car parks, and the Clashburn also burst its banks at the eastern end of the mire. So hopefully that just gives you a little bit of a picture of the wider picture and the local picture in Kinross itself. I'm just going to move on now to talk about the operational response from the various public authorities. Just invite Stuart Watson from the Council's Roads Maintenance Partnership to give us a next part. Thanks, now.
Thanks, Peter. Good evening. My name's Stuart Watson. I'm the Roads Maintenance Partnership Manager, and I'm responsible for the team that provide the out hours response to out hours emergencies in terms of the Council's response, as well as reactive response throughout the day. Routinely, we have 2 road supervisors and 4 road workers on standby throughout a 24-hour period. They do a full day's job, and then they're available for call out overnight or over the weekend, and they react to calls put through to them from our out hours call handlers who are based in Aberdeen City Council. On the 11th and 12th, the council officers were aware of the Met Office Be Aware yellow warning covering this period. However, to put that in a perspective, last year we had 35 such warnings, and this year to date another 37. And we've only had 3 out of the 72 having any effect, including this one, so we don't automatically put any special measures in place. We also had no river flood warnings in place that would prompt any additional measures being implemented either on that occasion. Aberdeen City Council had 7 call handlers working, taking calls, but were overwhelmed by the number of calls from Perth and Kinross Council residents, Aberdeen City Council residents, Aberdeenshire and Highland as the storm spread north. They received 219 calls they could answer and pass on, and 267 that they could not answer for Perth and Kinross. And if you called and couldn't get through, I apologise, but it was down to sheer volume. The calls that were answered do, however, channel down to 2 supervisors at night and 3 or 4 supervisors throughout the course of the day. We have on call to deal with this, to deal with a storm of such intensity. We pretty much need a full workforce in place to deal with it reactively, to deal with everything that came in. If you called and again we didn't attend, I apologise, but the team were swamped. The 2 road workers we had based in Blairgowrie overnight were called into Perth. But this then left us short in the Blairgowrie area when the weather hit further north. Throughout the course of the night on the 11th and 12th, additional staff were called in from 3 AM and 4 AM as the severity of the storm impacted. But we do have to be careful how many we bring in overnight, as that does impact on the number of people we've got available during the day, and that was the case on the Thursday when on the Wednesday when we were short of numbers to put around the entire council area to deal with all the issues that we had to deal with. All our officers and road workers did continue throughout the day, with the exception of 2 that had been up for the entire night. And that was to tidy up the damage and make repairs, and they continue to make repairs even to this point in time as a result of the damage that we had. That was me, Peter. Thank you. Over to the fire service response.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. Just to ask Mike Rumgay from the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Hi, everybody. My name is Mike Rumgay. I'm the station commander based at Perth Fire Station, and I was the on-call officer for that evening, the 12th of August. So it was a really challenging night for the fire service. We had over 700 calls locally. There was 2,000 calls nationally. So we were having to make that, the control rooms were having to make that decision for the fire service to respond to threat to life predominantly. We started receiving the first calls from Kinross just about 8 o'clock to Quake Place. Advice was given the occupiers there. And as the morning went on, we started to receive more calls. More or less all the resources from Perth were tied up at incidents all around Perth itself. But a background to the evening, as the storm had moved up from sort of Edinburgh into Fife and then up into the Perth and Kinross, the Perth and rest of like Tayside appliances were mobilised into Fife to assist with what was going on down there. We started to draw them back when things started to pick up in Perth itself. So there was appliances from all over the county sort of assisting at various locations. We had a large farm fire at Dunning which tied up 7 resources, and then as the morning went on, calls mounting up, they had the train crash up north, so that obviously then prioritised a lot of appliances to get mobilised up to that part of the country. We hope we were able to get to everybody that required assistance from the fire service. If we didn't, I can only apologise on behalf of the fire service for not being there for you, to support you. And if anyone's got any questions as the night goes on, please ask me, and I'll do my best to answer them for you. Thanks very much.
Good stuff, thanks Mike. Now we would normally move on to get Stuart Watson on the call, but he's not been able to make it tonight. He's been on most of our calls previously. If anyone has anything they want to ask Police Scotland about either the flood event in February or the one in August, you can just pop that into the chat box and we'll pass it on and get a response back to you. Can we have the next slide, please? Oh, too far. Thank you. So next slide is just about the ongoing flood recovery work and then the sort of future flood risk management plans for Kinross. So first of all, just like to ask Carol Rayburn from the Scottish Flood Forum to talk to us a little bit now. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Carol Rayburn and I'm Director of the Scottish Flood Forum. We may have met already when we had Flow, our recovery vehicle in Kinross a couple of weeks ago, and we have been in the community working with you since the February floods. The Scottish Flood Forum can help you in a number of ways. The first is in response to any insurance queries and issues that you may have. The second is in relation to property flood protection measures. So that's about the installation of things like air brick covers, non-return valves on sewage systems, etc., and all the measures that a homeowner can implement to protect their property or to minimise the impact of flooding in the future. The other way that we can also support you is to work with you to set up a community group. And we have a number of these up and down Scotland, who local residents coming together and perhaps as flood wardens, in other cases helping local residents to put in those door covers, etc. In the time of flooding, and working together as part of a community response. So if you would like us to come out and carry out a property level protection assessment, then please get in contact with us. We have been out in the town carrying out some of these surveys for you, but we are a small team of 5, and there's quite a high demand at the moment, but we will get to you. And if you have any queries, as I said earlier, please put them in the chat box and we'll try and answer them for you this evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. Now, the next item in presentation was just to talk a little bit about community resilience work. Now, the council does have an officer who can assist communities to help set up a group if the community wants to go about doing that. If there's an interest and an appetite for that, the council will support that. And the chap's name is Keith Colville. He can help you set up a flood or a general emergency response plan and to work with the council. And quite often we've got other examples of flood resilience groups being set up elsewhere in Perth and Kinross, and they're able to access sources of funding for things like flood products and sandbags and flood sacks, these kinds of things that are available, and we can put you in touch with those sources of funding for that. So if anyone's interested, again, just use the chat box. Also conscious that in the community, obviously a number of residents are living in council housing, and just a little update we've got from the housing service that they have surveyed affected council houses, those that were affected by flood in February, and they are intending to fit air brick covers to those properties, and door guards as well will be fitted where required. And there's also an issue to do with a drainage survey, but that's planned, and the council is currently awaiting the drainage contractor getting started on that work. And if any residents want any further information on this, they can either contact the council's housing service directly or pop a question in the chat box and we'll pass that on to them. Now we normally move on to get SEPA to give us an update. Normally Karen Bloodworth from SEPA's on these calls, but she can't make it this week. But SEPA have given us some information to read out. I'm going to ask James Escott, who's the engineer in the council's flooding team, to read that out for us. Thanks, James.
Hello. Right, I'll read the statement from SEPA. The Scottish Flood Forecasting Service is provided in partnership by SEPA and the Met Office. The service produces a daily national flood guidance statement which is issued to Category 1 and 2 agencies, including local authorities and emergency responders, and provides an assessment of the risk of flooding for the next 5 days. The SFFS, that's the forecasting service, also supports SEPA's Floodline service, which provides live flooding information and advice on how to prepare or cope with the impacts of flooding 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. For those registered with Floodline, they can receive flood messages for an area of interest direct to their phone. For the recent flood event on the 11th and 12th of August, SEPA issued a flood alert for Tayside on the 10th of August, highlighting a risk of heavy thundery showers which may result in flooding impacts from surface water and small watercourses. The flood alert was updated over the following days and when further information was available. Due to the difficulty in forecasting summer intense thunderstorms in terms of location and timings, we are unable to provide specific location information where the impacts may occur, and therefore the risk of flooding impacts from these storms is highlighted across a larger regional area. SEPA have made a commitment to explore and trial available approaches to surface water flood forecasting and hope to make developments in this over the coming years. SEPA undertook some post-flood analysis looking at the rain gauges in the network where available. The gauge nearest Kinross registered about half a month's rainfall within 5 hours. However, this gauge may not have captured the highest rainfall totals. If you would like more information on floodline, please visit the website at www.floodlinescotland.org.uk or contact SEPA via the SEPA website, which is www.sepa.org.uk/contact. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Now, if we do have any questions that you want to raise with SEPA, again, just use the chat box. We can get those passed on and answered by Karen Bloodworth at SEPA, and Karen's SEPA's flood advisor for the area. Now, next items on the presentation. The first one is flood risk management plans. So just to talk a little bit about that. So the flood risk management plans for the Kinross area are currently available to view on the Council's website. SEPA published their flood risk management strategies in December 2015, and the Council's current flood risk management plans were published in June 2016, and they're all available on our website. Kinross is located within one of 254 areas in Scotland that have been identified as being at medium to high risk of flooding, these so-called potentially vulnerable areas, or PVAs as we call them. The plans that we've got at present have been undergoing a review, and there will be a public consultation on the next round of plans, which will be published by SEPA in December 2021 and by local authorities in June 2022. But the initial versions of those will be subject to public consultation early next year, so you should be able to see what's in there for the Kinross area. Under the current plans, Council is obviously promoting the South Kinross Flood Protection Scheme. And in the meantime, businesses, residents, etc. are advised to take action to reduce the risk of flooding to their property if they can, and we've touched on some of that earlier on in the presentation. Just to give you a bit of an update about the flood scheme itself. The Council continues to develop proposals for the flood protection scheme. Unfortunately, the timescale for delivering the scheme is lengthy, as it is for most of these schemes, and the Council has limited staff resources and is also working on a number of other schemes in other communities. The projects are very complex and depend on the approval of many third parties, legislative requirements and other statutory consent, so it's not always possible to accelerate them and to deliver them any faster. Appreciate this is of concern to local residents, but there are other things that you can do to manage flooding in the meantime. And we set out those in our July 2020 update to the local community, and again in the recent flood bulletin, and there's advice and information on various matters, including flood forecasting, how you can prepare ahead of flooding, insurance matters and maintenance in those documents. Our consultant engineers, RPS Group, have completed the hydraulic model for the South Quay, the Gelly Burn and the Clash Burn, and have been working on the economic appraisal for the flood scheme. Looking at the potential flood damages to properties in the area. They're currently reviewing the potential options for the scheme, looking at flood walls, flood embankments, dredging, upstream storage, And they're also assessing if natural flood management could contribute to the scheme proposals by reducing the volume of water that reaches Kinross following heavy rainfall. Once our response to the August flooding has settled down, we'll be able to review the flood scheme options with our consultant engineers and come back to the community with a bit more detail on the scheme. In the meantime, we've carried out a bit of further CCTV survey work for drainage in the area on the culverted parts of the Clash Burn. A new manhole has been installed at Smith Street, and some partial blockages have been cleared from culverts in order to alleviate the risk of future flooding. So just moving on to the last item now, ongoing communication arrangements. We have obviously received quite a high volume of correspondence since the August flooding, and unfortunately we've not been able to answer everybody's queries as quickly as we would like. We've had to prioritise quite a high volume of correspondence. I think we've now had something like over 450 inquiries have come in. So apologies if we haven't get back to you. We'll get back to you. It might just take us a bit of time. We have set up a generic email address, flood@pkce.gov.uk, to help us sort of route all of these inquiries through, and that is monitored on a constant basis. And we've got the Flooding Council's webpage set up for the August 2020 flooding, and the links to the generic email address and the webpage are on the next slide on the presentation. And hopefully we'll get some more community bulletins out to the local residents and businesses just to keep them updated as to what's going on. And I think, as Keith said at the start, if anyone looking for further updates or an opportunity for further meetings after tonight, then just pop your request into the chat box. And having said all that, I'll hand back to Keith McNamara. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter, and thanks everybody for your presentation. That was really helpful, and I think it has begun to answer some of the questions. What I'm supposed to do for the next stage of proceedings is basically go through each of the individual questions and comments. What we find with these events, colleagues begin to answer the questions in the chat as well, so that kind of helps build a picture of responses. So just to take these one by one. So the first question, which Peter's just confirmed, was would we be recording this meeting for those that are not online? Yeah, absolutely. I think I maybe mentioned at the start it will be available on YouTube, so people can log in and go into YouTube and view the entirety of the meeting. Next question comes from Will. He would like to know more about the planned flood defence measures for the South Quake. What is exactly being done in the long term, and where's the work being done? And is there anywhere where residents can view plans and track the progress? I think, Peter, you kind of picked that up from what you were saying. Once our activity settled down, we'll look at what happened in August, add it to the flood plans, and then come back out to the communities. On the screen there is the contact information, the website for the flooding, and the council website and email. So we would ask residents to kind of keep your eye on that. And then maybe anything else you want to add to that, Peter, over and above what you said in your presentation?
Yeah, I appreciate residents and local businesses will be looking for a bit of detail, Keith, on that, and we're kind of not at that stage yet, unfortunately. The original flood study that was done for South Kinross showed there was nothing particularly fancy about the proposals. It was just flood walls essentially running along both banks of the South Quay through the urban area in Kinross there, from the kind of old yard where the Gelly Burn meets the South Quay, sorry, running right down past the bridge and right down as far as the confluence with Loch Leven. Now that was a kind of interim proposal. What we're looking at now is other options, so that's still on the table. Some sort of variations on that have been looked at, but we're also looking further upstream to see if we can store floodwater further up in the catchment. We're looking at natural flood management techniques for that as well, or whether we can use natural features in the land, sort of low areas and fields, that kind of thing, further upstream to store floodwater. So it's not just going to be hopefully walls and embankments. We are going to look at other things, or combination of options, and that's what the consultant engineers are on with at the moment. They're looking at all those things, they're modelling them, comparing them, and trying to work out which ones are the best. So I don't have a set of drawings yet I can show anyone, unfortunately, but we'll get to that point. and we'll get to a point, hopefully probably early next year, where we'll be getting regular newsletters out to the community, and there'll be plans and drawings and something a bit more concrete that they can look at. And we'll certainly be running that past the community, as we do anywhere else with a draft, a proposed flood scheme, to get their feedback and their input to it, and any sort of good ideas and local knowledge, etc. So we'll get to that. We're just unfortunately not quite at that point yet.
Thanks very much, Peter. And I think that commitment to engage with the community, take the good ideas, have that discussion, I think is really, really helpful and welcome. So thanks for that. Next couple of comments are similar. A couple of comments in relation to why we're only focusing on the August 11th, 12th flooding. There was devastating flooding on the 21st of February this year, and we're not necessarily concentrating on that. I guess, Peter, when you look at the flood studies, you'll be bearing in mind both the August and the February incidences.
Yeah, Keith. I mean, everyone's right. People who have put the comments in the chat box are absolutely right. The February event this year was actually a bigger flood than the August event. They were kind of similar in magnitude, but the February event was bigger and had a bigger impact on the local community. So we certainly acknowledge that. But yeah, we consider information from any flood event in the study work that we're doing. And I know after February, the consultant engineers kind of revisited their modelling and updated things, and that resulted in a few changes, and we'll certainly take account of the August flooding as well. But I think it's where we're at, because we had this big event right across Perth and Kinross, and so we're kind of a little bit focused on that at the moment, but we are minded that the bigger event in Kinross was certainly back in February. And we did have officers out on the ground after the February event talking to locals, etc. So there was a response to that at that time. But no, we're certainly aware of both events, and we'll certainly take all the information we can from both of them, and that will inform where we go next.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks to the residents for raising that about February. I think hopefully giving assurance, Peter, that that's not been forgotten about and will be factored in. Next question, just a question around, does Kinross still have a fire service? Mike's given an answer in the box. Yes, the Kinross does have its own fire appliance, crewed by retained firefighters. If they're unavailable due to lack of crew, you can send resources from Lochgelly, Auchtermurty and Perth provide assistance. And Mike, you're saying if anybody in the call would be interested in making a contribution and joining the Kinross crew, please let you know in the chat. So Mike, do you want to maybe say a few words about retained firefighters and the valuable contribution they make?
Yeah, of course, Keith. As I said in the reply there, that the RDS, the retained duty system in Kinross, they're basically people have got normal Monday, Friday, regular jobs that carry a pager on them. So when they're at home or they're in the town, a fire call comes in, then they can respond to that. Round about where Kinross is, the closest whole-time station, which is like a full-time, 24/7 fire station's Lochgelly. Back in before it was the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, and you had your regionalised areas like Fife and Tayside. Tayside would respond predominantly to Kinross, so Perth would be backing them up all the time. But when we moved to the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service in 2013, that sort of broke down those boundaries, if you want to say, and because Lochgelly's closer, they'd obviously respond. Being in the RDA, the retained in Kinross it's a fantastic opportunity for people to learn new skills, develop themselves further. They're always on the lookout for new people to join. So if they are interested, by all means, either go onto the Scottish Fire and Rescue website, or even just pop around to the station itself and have a chat with the crew there, and I'm sure they'll be able to point them in the right direction for something they'd be interested in doing.
That's great, Mike. Thanks very much. Moving on to the next question, residents saying, we know exactly where the creek burn overflows. Its banks on a consistent basis. The water flows through onto Clashburn Road, but seems we're forgotten about on the north side. I'll maybe come back to that point, and Peter might have a comment around that one. And then saying the storm drains on Clashburn Road are so often blocked, the water builds up and traffic coming through it causes tidal surges. And the resident observed 5 completely choked storm drains in the vicinity as recently as yesterday. Stuart Watson has responded to say we cleans gullies every 2 years in Kinross as part of our programme. It says we lost just under 4 months ability to do that because of COVID lockdown, although we're working through the programme. And Stuart, you're suggesting that if any residents notice any block drains or whatever, then if they could phone the council's contact centre or online via something called My PKC to report the blockage, and it will go to the local supervisor and arrange to deal with as soon as possible. I'll backtrack a bit. Peter, is there anything you want to say in relation to the comment about we know where the Quakeburn overflows into Closhburn Road?
Yeah, thanks, Keith. Yeah, absolutely. Local people know, they know the burn, they know how it floods, they know what happens. We, for our part, consultant engineers are got quite an extensive model of the Closhburn and the other two water courses, and it goes for quite some distance upstream and right down to Loch Leven itself. So we are capturing all these flow paths. While they're aware of them, and we'll look at the flood scheme, we'll look at flood protection measures that will deal with that flood risk, and as I say, we'll come back to residents. We'll be sharing flood maps for them to comment on, and any proposals for flood protection measures. So yeah, we will capture that at the right time going forward.
Thanks, Peter. Stuart, I know you.
Oh, sorry.
I was going to say you've given quite a comprehensive response in there, but give you the opportunity if there's any supplementaries you want to add in.
Yeah, I was just going to say, very often in a storm situation as well, it's actually the pipe that the road gully is draining into that is inundated, and it results in the gully being unable to discharge. If the gullies were blocked as recently as yesterday, that's obviously not the case there, and I'll speak to the supervisor to arrange a machine to go out there. But in the middle of a storm event such as that, it is very often just a capacity issue for the pipe work that the road drain is discharging into.
Thanks very much, Stuart.
Can I just add as well, Keith,
Sure.
a little element I forgot about, the consultants are modelling as well. I'm focusing on the water courses, but they are modelling the drainage systems in the area. We're actually going to have a combined integrated model of the water courses and those drainage systems. So as well as looking at the direct flood risk from the water courses, we'll be looking at any water that spills out of manholes and that kind of things, and creates surface water flooding, sort of behind any potential flood defences. So that'll be getting looked at as well. And the typical things you look at for that are additional drainage measures or pumping stations or storage areas, those kinds of things. So that is getting considered as part of the current project as well.
Thanks, Peter. That's reassuring to know it's not, as you say, it's not just the river flooding, it's all sources. So hopefully that gives some reassurance on that one. The next question was from a resident saying they tried to call the flood forum today, had some difficulties, and Carol very helpfully has put the details of the flood forum for further contact. And as I think Carol said earlier on, it is a small team, they're dealing with multiple events, so I'm sure Carol will be able to pick up if you make contact directly on that one. Next question or next comment, a resident here in Kinross for nearly 50 years, the South Quake has been flooding this area longer than 1993. Flooding occurred back in the mid-1980s. Why has nothing been done before now? And then a frustration about flood defences in Milnathorpe, but nothing has been done here in Kinross. I know there is an element of prioritisation of the council's activities in terms of flood defence work or flood mitigation work. Peter, do you want to maybe pick that up?
Sure, yeah. Definitely 1993 is always a date in January that year in everyone's memories. If you're anywhere near the Tay catchment and down this way as well, a lot of these communities suffered really badly back then. I joined the council in 2007, so I can't really answer for what happened before that. I know Perth and Kinross has always been very active in terms of trying to get flood defences in, and we've now got 6 flood schemes in a number of different areas. Kinross, yeah, it's always been there, and we've always been aware of the flood risk. But, there's just been a big problem right across the whole of the council's area and across Scotland, I suppose. The current situation is Kinross is firmly embedded in a flood risk management plan. It's the one for the Forth Estuary, actually. And we've had a flood study that was done back about 2010. When I joined the council in 2007, there was a bit of a commitment at that point to carry out a flood study, so that's all been done. Flood schemes do unfortunately take a long time. there's a process you have to go through doing a feasibility study, and that kind of justifies attracting some investment, and you do a bit of further work, and then it kind of a bit of a slow burn, but it gathers a bit of pace, and it does take a while. So we're well down that process now, hopefully, and Kinross is within a potentially vulnerable area. It's got a scheme in place, funding's in place from the Scottish Government for it, so we're in a much better place now. So yeah, it has taken a long time. Unfortunately, that is the nature of the beast sometimes, but hopefully we've got solutions coming. It'll take a few years, but we're working through that process.
Thanks, Peter. And these are, as you say, such intensive projects, multiple years and multiple millions of pounds. So at least hopefully you're giving some reassurance to residents that we're moving in hopefully a good direction in terms of looking to resolutions for this. Next point was inquiring why isn't the quay getting cleaned out. My dad brought the councilmen down to the quay at the boathouse. The councilmen agreed it needed to be done, but they said the problem was with SEPA. Has this been discussed with SEPA? And Stuart, you were saying it's probably not necessarily the right thing for our operatives to be maybe making a snapshot judgment, and it needs a bit more rounded opinion from you and your team and Peter's team in terms of what actually needs done. Anything else you want to add to that, Stuart?
No, it was just that very fact, Keith. It's very easy for, and I've done it myself a number of years ago to make a snap judgment on something you're seeing at that moment in time, and it's only when you discuss it with Peter and his colleagues who are flooding experts that you realise the potential impacts of you doing that on other folks downstream or upstream. So it's got to get that overview and not just a snapshot. I'm not saying there isn't clearance required. I'm just saying it's difficult. It's dangerous taking an opinion of somebody that's having a look at it at a moment in time. Okay,
thanks, Stuart.
I was just going to say, Keith, that we're quite happy to take any opinions, any information that we've got about watercourses is good. We do carry out routine inspections. They're scheduled in. I think we'll probably do South Quay twice a year. But obviously, in between those sort of formal inspections that we do, we're happy to receive any reports of any obstructions and blockages. So the council's got duty under the Flood Risk Management Scotland Act to do inspections and assessment of bodies of water, and that's what those inspections are about. We just tend to look in the flooding team for, as I say, obstructions, anything that might increase flood risk during a flood event. Quite often people report to us sort of minor things. It might be a bit of vegetation or a bit of sediment, whatever, and when we look at it, we don't really consider that it is going to cause a problem during a flood event. But if we do put those things in the schedule, and then we do carry out clearance works. That's a little bit distinct from actually sort of full-scale engineered dredging of watercourses, which is a different thing, and that is licensed by SEPA. And if we were to go and try and do that, we would have to sort of demonstrate to SEPA that that's the best sustainable environmental option and best option in terms of flood risk management. And that brings us back to the flood study work and the flood scheme work that we're doing at the moment, and that will be fully considered, reported back to the community as a potential option for flood risk management, and we'll come back to you about that in the near future.
Okay, thanks, gents. Next question relates to why do only council tenants get flood measures but not private homes? We pay our council tax like everyone else. I think I'll start the ball rolling on that, and if colleagues want to add anything to it. The responsibility for flood lies with the owner of the property. So because for council housing, the council is the owner of the property, that's why the flood measures are put in. However, reflecting back to what both Carol and Peter were saying, we're more than delighted to work with local communities about community solutions, and there are other sources of funding which are available to help communities in terms of supporting flood defence work or flood measures at a property level. Carol, is there anything else you want to add to that?
The first step in the process is to work out what is right for the homeowner and what's the right measures for the property. And the Scottish Flood Forum does offer the free service that we mentioned. earlier at the top of the meeting. So if you would wish to have an assessment of what might be right for you and your home, then please get in contact with us and we'll arrange an appointment to carry out that assessment. And that's then a good starting point to think about the measures that would be appropriate for your home.
Thank you very much, Carol. Next question relates to the sluice gates for Loch Leven. Are they fully opened when the water levels start to rise, which may alleviate the problem? There was an antiquated agreement apparently between Loch Leven Trust and the mills in Fife and water flows and levels. Stuart, you respond the council doesn't control the sluice gates at the loch, but you're going to ask a colleague to find out what arrangements are in place for the responsible body. Anything else on that, Stuart?
No, it's just I was aware that there were sluice gates there, but as I said, I'm not controlled by the council, but we can make inquiries to find out what the arrangements are by the responsible body. Yeah.
Thanks, Stuart. We can take that as an action.
Just we're aware of this old agreement as well, Keith, and the flooding team, and it's been a bit of a detective story over the years to try and sort of track it down. Obviously, we're aware that the sluices there, you can see them quite plainly, and we've been trying to, and we have contacted people to get sort of background information on that. I mean, what we do in terms of the sort of flood study modelling work is we do assume quite a variation in Loch Leven, and the kind of worst case scenario is obviously the loch is pretty full to quite a high level, and then we'll look at what flood protection and flood defence measures need to go in to try and protect against that. So it's, yeah, certainly something we're aware of.
Okay, cheers, Peter. Next point, resident was saying they were told in July that the floodgates and air vent covers had been ordered, and since have had an email saying that once the drain survey has been done, when is this getting done? James very helpfully responded in the chat to say housing have planned the drain survey and they're waiting for the contractor to give their availability to carry out the work. James, I don't know if you're aware of any timescale for that at all?
Not beyond. It really depends when the contractor's going to be available to do it. So the question, the contractor has been asked to say when they are available to do it.
Okay, so it's from what you're saying, it sounds like it's quite imminent once the contractor's available. So that'll hopefully give some reassurance. Thank you. Next question is saying, how do residents stop the Quaich Burn from bursting its banks? No amount of sandbags, etc. will stop the water coming through the floorboards. There must be interim measures that can be done until proper flood measures are in place. Maybe one for you, Peter?
Yeah, thanks, Keith. Yeah, difficult because it's a reasonable sized watercourse, and the flooding occurs along quite a distance along the banks of the Quaich. So it's a similar problem, that it's difficult to put in place, like a sandbag wall or something quickly in advance of these flood events. We don't often get a great amount of warning of where it's going to happen, and trying to get that response in place is difficult. And it has been tried elsewhere. We try and put sandbags out in certain places where water comes out along a short length of riverbank. Sometimes you can contain it if it's not too deep, but quite often you'll find that the water will either just go around the sandbag wall or go over the top of it. So it is quite a difficult problem. So there isn't really an interim solution, unfortunately, until we get some sort of scheme in place. Either get flood walls, permanent flood walls, or embankments, or some sort of upstream measures that are going to retain the flood water a bit higher up the catchment. No sort of simple, easy solution, unfortunately, in the interim period.
Yeah, it's a shame, Peter, but I appreciate how much work has to go into the studies to make sure that when it is implemented, it's implemented correctly. Next question from Will. Am I to understand that there isn't an actual structure planned to deal with the flooding at the South Quaich? It's just investigative work. Can you let residents know how long this investigation and assessment period will take place? I know you kind of touched on that earlier on, Peter, about the timescale, and obviously because of the multiple flood events that we've had to deal with across Perth and Kinross, you're dealing with all of these, and that obviously takes your time away from specific flood studies such as in South Kinross, but you might want to say a bit more on that.
Yeah, that's it, Keith, exactly. In a nutshell, the team are out at the moment dealing with clearing water courses, etc., following on from the flooding that happened. And the rest of us are, responding to a lot of concerns and inquiries that have come in. So it does detract a little bit from our work on the project. We've got the consultant engineers; they've been working on it right the way through lockdown, and they've kept on it recently. But obviously, they need a bit of input from us as their client. So we'll get back to that soon. I think what we're looking at the sort of first quarter of next year to get through the current sort of phase of modelling that we're at, and to just nail down these various options that we're looking at into one sort of preferred option, which we'll then take to the community, and that'll all be shown at that time. So there is a plan. There's a full project being implemented. There's a programme there, and we'll be happy to share a bit of further detail with residents on that going forward. I think in terms of actually getting the flood defences in place, it is sort of 3 years away as a kind of programme timescale. I know people are concerned about the length of time it's taken. It's difficult for us, as I've already said, to try and accelerate that. And sadly, the thing we do find is that there's complications come up with flood schemes, and if anything, things can take a little bit longer. But we're trying to stick to our programme for the time being. I think what you'll find is once we get in a better position with the modelling work that we've got, and we've got a bit more concrete plans going forward, you'll start to see more frequent updates from us in more detail on that, and hopefully we'll be able to answer some more detailed questions at that point. So keep an eye out for the early stages of next year.
That's great, thank you, Peter. Question around the Quaich full of form matter, including motorway barriers. It should be an easy and quick measure to clear this as an interim measure. I'm not too sure if that's a Stuart or a Peter response.
Probably myself, Keith. Yeah, if people are aware, or I wasn't aware of motorway barriers, they maybe been thrown in. If they're aware of the location of those, let us know. I'm happy to send someone out to check. We've got people who can do inspections, so we can check that. Yeah, and if there is, some form of obstruction on the watercourse, we do just get a works order written and get it cleared pretty quickly. And we've got contractors who can clear vegetation and trees, or if it's more urban debris, shopping trolleys, bread baskets, tyres, or motorway barriers, whatever it might be. Yeah, we're quite happy to fish those things out and let the watercourse do its thing.
That's great. Thanks very much for that reassurance, Peter. Next question was just a bit of clarification about the question about the road workers, or the comment that was road workers that gave the information at the boathouse, and it was just confirming it was members of the flood team, but Stuart's responded to that one, so I'm not going to go into that one in further detail. I think we've dealt with that one. Further question about the timescales once measures are decided to implementation, which I think you've responded to, Peter, but there was a supplementary question: will budgets be a constraint? So Peter, invite you to say something about budgets and maybe how it's funded.
Yep. So the South Kinross Flood Protection Scheme is one of, I think, 42 flood schemes in Scotland that are on a national priority list. So these were all prioritised back in 2016, I think, when we published the flood risk management plans. I can't remember what number Kinross is sitting at. It doesn't really matter because it is above the line. And I think the government is committed to funding those schemes, and South Kinross is one of them. So the commitment from the government is they will fund 80% of the cost of the flood scheme up to the point where we have tenders back in from a contractor. They will fund 80% of that capital cost, and the council's put aside provision to fund the remaining 20% of that. So we're in quite a good place now with the new flood schemes that we're doing. In years gone by, you were always chasing funding. You had to go and design your scheme and submit it to the Scottish ministers and to the government, and then you had to do quite a lot of work before you attracted the grant funding. But now it's already in place and it's supporting the design development, so we're already benefiting from that. So there is a funding package in place for the scheme, and we just need to get on and deliver it, really. So no, budgets shouldn't be a constraint, although we can't let the budget run away with itself. We're trying to keep things pinned down and stay within budget, and that'll depend on the final measure that we've got, the final option or group of options, the combination of options that are recommended. But we are, budgets aren't a constraint at the moment, so there's not a problem with that.
Okay, thanks, Peter. That gives a lot of reassurance around budgets because we know how constrained they usually are, so thanks for that. A question, next one is, what is SEPA doing on the management of the rivers? Looking at the Gellyburn, there's no management at all done. That might be something we might have to refer an answer to SEPA unless anyone can help out with that at all.
Yeah, I think, to be fair to SEPA, they don't actually do any physical management really, Keith. So we are the council of the party who will go out and clear watercourses and remove obstructions and the like. SEPA have a role as the flood warning authority. They are the national authority under the Flood Risk Management Scotland Act, so they set the strategy for Scotland and the 14 catchments, Fourth Estuary being the one that we're concerned with here. They license a lot of and regulate a lot of activity on rivers, but they don't actually carry it. They're not like the Environment Agency down in England and Wales, for instance, who actually carry out work themselves. That the work is done by mainly local authorities in Scotland. Sometimes, if we're talking about sewers and drainage works, it's Scottish Water. Another key party I'm missing obviously is landowners, because landowners, as you said earlier, are primarily responsible for flooding, and if you're a riparian landowner on a watercourse, the main responsibility sits with you. And obviously if the council's a landowner, then it's the council. So sometimes we do carry out clearance works on watercourses under the Flood Act ourselves, under the duty we've got. Sometimes we do carry them out as a landowner. I don't think we own much land in the South Quay, I'd have to check that. But hopefully that clarifies the kind of situation between SEPA and local authorities.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Next point was suggesting there was no fire service present when the flooding happened in August at the South End. I know Mike's probably responded to that in your presentation, Mike, to say you were just so pulled in so many directions that there were issues with trying to fit support everywhere. Is there anything else you want to add to that, Mike?
Just that the control room were having to make that sort of decision at the time of call. If the call was threat to life, then they would mobilise somebody out to assist. I hope that wasn't the case in any of the circumstances in Kinross that day. But if it was, if you could please let me know, that would be much appreciated. But certainly with the sort of the feedback we've had from that day, that there wasn't a requirement to send a fire appliance down at that time. But if that's incorrect, then please come back and tell me.
Thanks, Mike. It's part of this is learning from what's happened, so yeah, I appreciate that.
I can just add a little bit there, Keith, that the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service did contact the council, and that initiated the delivery of sandbags in August, and that was confirmed in the flood bulletin we put out. So while the fire service might not have been there, they did trigger a response to Kinross at that time.
Thank you.
Keith, just Stuart here as well. I think that's what triggered the pump that the council have that we got sent down as well. We finished at Marshall Place and got a relief crew because we didn't know how long we'd be at Quake Place, and headed down to Kinross with the 6-inch pump that we possessed.
Thanks, Stuart. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, so we did deploy resources to there, and I think it is, pardon the pun, but it was all hands to the pumps with these types of things. So thanks for that. Next comment is suggesting it does rather feel that the Kinross event was not treated as a priority in February, and until Perth was flooded in August there was no real action. I think that's possibly been covered by what colleagues have said previously, and James put in the response. The flood scheme for Kinross started in March 2019, so the actual flood scheme has been on the go before the 2020 February floods, and then James was also saying members of the flood team visited houses and businesses in February, and information fed back to the consultants for the study. So we did visit affected people and visit householders and businesses in February. Peter or James, is there anything else you want to add to that response?
Probably only, Keith, that we just kind of thinking back, there was a bit of discussion about having some form of public meeting following the February event, but I think we were quickly into the early stages of lockdown, middle of March, end of March. I think that's probably why it didn't quite happen. But as James has said there, We did have boots on the ground speaking to residents, and there was quite a lot of discussions back at that time to try and sort of reassure people as to what was going on with the flood scheme and what they could do in terms of flood products, flood line and all that kind of thing as well, to help them out in the meantime.
Thanks, Peter. Next question, I think it's a really valid question. Who should residents call first when the burn is approaching critical levels? I'm kind of guessing Mike want to have a response, and perhaps Stuart as well, but I'll maybe start with Mike.
Yeah, if there's a burn that's about to overspill into your property, you would probably contact the fire service. Depending if it was a risk to life, as I said earlier, then we would respond to that. If it wasn't a risk to life, we would probably be advised to contact the council themselves for sandbags as a way of sort of shoring up your house to make sure the water doesn't enter. So I would say that unless it was an immediate risk to life, probably the first instance would be to contact the council, or you'd likely be directed to contact the council.
Sure. Thanks. Stuart, anything to add to that?
Yeah, it's just to say that we've got, as I said in the introduction, we have a small number of people on 24-hour standby. We don't have guys sitting or ladies sitting in the depot waiting for a call. So we do take a while to mobilise. What generally happens is if we get a call, the road supervisor will head out to take a look and call the road workers as he's heading out to take a look, so as they can mobilise and get to the depot as soon as possible, and then attend from there. Depending on who's on the standby rota, we do have some guys that are based in Kinross on standby. We do have guys in Perth that are based on are on standby as well. So if it's a Perth-based crew that are on standby the week that it's an issue, it will take us longer to get there, but we'll attend as soon as we can. We'll have a range of sandbags and pumps available, and again, with the guys we've got on board, if they could they could load up the pump and put it on a lorry and take it down. It just depends on what the supervisor finds when he gets there. But it's not, we can't turn that around in an hour or anything like that. It would take a couple of hours for us to turn around attendance by our road worker crews to deal with the work, although our supervisor should get there quicker.
Okay, thanks, Stuart. Thanks, Mike, as well. Point from Councillor Callum Purvis. It's maybe picking up on something that we've said earlier on, saying whilst appreciating the statutory timescales that make it difficult to expedite flood defences, clearly 3 years is a long time to wait, and there's a risk of further flooding. Other than building community resilience, which seems to be the default answer, what can the council do by way of implementing interim measures to help protect local residents' homes and businesses? I think you were saying earlier on, Peter, that there's not really an awful lot that can be done in the interim, and I think perhaps although Callum's describing it as a default answer, it probably is the best sort of fit interim answer we can do. In the meantime, working together with our communities, with the Scottish Flood Forum, with the council and other partners to go for a more property level protection activity. Anything else you want to add to that, Peter?
Yeah, thanks, Keith. We've put out community bulletins, and there's a frequently asked questions document we put out as well, which has got a few things in it, just information and advice. There's a whole section in there which we've actually taken from SEPA's Floodline webpage, and it's got the 5 steps in there. So it's signing up to Floodline, so you can receive advance notice, and that lets you take action, hopefully in advance of flooding. Prepare a flood plan for your family and for your own property. Basic things like how to shut off gas, electricity and water supplies if you need to. Keep your useful list of contact numbers, including your insurance company and utility providers. And the critical one, I think we've touched on a few times, is try and make your home more resilient using flood protection products. Get a source of sandbags in advance of flooding and have them ready, and ensure that your insurance covers provides adequate cover for flood damage. And these are all things that the council and Scottish Flood Forum can help you with. you know, if the community wants to move and to set up a community flood resilience group, that helps. It helps get everyone together and get them kind of trained and ready, and gets them assistance and gets them access to potential sources of funding for these things as well. And there's just basic things like, you know, Met Office information. Do you know where to get your weather forecast and your flood warnings? And all that kind of thing. So that's all in that FAQ. In terms of the sort of flood plans that we have, we obviously, you know, will try and manage the flood risk in the watercourses by these inspections and the clearance works that we do. There's various other things in there, maybe that might not seem too helpful immediately to residents, but you know, we try and manage flood risk through the planning process. We try not to introduce too much additional development in areas, or the area, new development that might increase flood risk to existing properties. We have those self-help measures in there. While we're asking communities to try and improve their own resilience, it's not easy for them to do that. They need a bit of help and support. So, you know, the support's there from the council and the flood forum. We can all help with that as well. So there's various things that people can do. It really often just is a matter of everyone trying to do what they can. Local authority trying to get the flood defences in, keeping the burn clear, the river clear. You know, local residents doing their bit with flood products and floodline, etc. Scottish Water doing their bit with sewers, and hopefully together that gives us, you know, we can all try and tackle flooding together in a much more effective way going forward. I know it's not ideal. Living with flooding is difficult, but given the way climate change is going, unfortunately we are going to have to live with flooding, and we are going to have to take it seriously. So I think the message is really, if everyone can try and do what they can, you know, the combined effort hopefully will move us forward and help residents out.
Thanks very much, Peter. I think that's a very strong message about everybody doing what they can. Carol, is there anything you want to add in terms of, I know you mentioned it in your introductory comments around, you know, community flood groups and community support, etc.?
Yeah, we have a number of local flood groups. There's not a specific one for Kinross, but we can work with you to set up a local group. What we have seen is, I suppose, one of the good sides of the COVID-19 aspect of it all, which has delayed responses from insurance companies and you know, repairs and reinstatement works as well, is that there has been a great influx in people who are wanting to get involved with their communities, wanting to help. And you know, if there was a good time to actually set up such a group, then now seems to be the time, because there are people coming forward who've got an interest in their community, who want to help. And if we can harness that, working together with the council, then you know, it's the first step on putting some of those perhaps interim measures in place. Thanks, Carol. Again, sound advice. Next comment relates to phoned the council on a blocked roadside drain, and it took 4 months for this to be cleared, and there was a pile of stones and earth left. Stuart has said, if sent more details in the email to the email address on the slide, we can follow that up. However, if this did take place during lockdown, the early phases of lockdown, then it could well be that might have been a factor. But we're more than happy to kind of pick up on that to see if there's any lessons we can learn. And as Stuart says, the debris shouldn't have been left anyway. So that's a point noted for ourselves. Next comment, and again, touches on a theme that a couple of comments have been making, but 2 floods in 6 months, resulting in residents being displaced from their home for 6 months, and the stress that this entails, plus the anxiety every time it rains, is not really being recognised. The length of time the project will take means homes could be flooded several more times by then. People need action quicker, whereas Kinross in the priority list. I think, Peter, you've articulated that Kinross is in the priority list, the sort of list of 42, and Kinross is above the line, if I can maybe abbreviate. And I think what we're saying is, I think if we can all do our bit around this, in terms of
the council's response, the flood forum, community groups, property level protection. I think it is a bit of, if we can all work together on this, then I'd like to think that we can give some degree of comfort and reassurance. And absolutely, we are recognising the anxiety and the fear that flooding causes and the massive disruption. I mean, please be conscious we're dealing with this 200 times because there was 200 houses flooded in the August events, as Peter said at the start. So we absolutely want to help us wherever we can, and we want to help communities and residents help themselves, but also what we can do to help as well. So we are taking this very, very seriously, and flood studies and the flood alleviation measures do take time to implement. So please be reassured around that. Peter, is there anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think you've covered it, Keith. Yeah, do certainly recognise the anxiety. And if you want to check where Kinross sits in terms of sort of national priority lists, etc., it's all in the published flood risk management plan. In terms of our schemes, I think the scheme we have in Comrie was our top place flood scheme, followed by a small surface water scheme that we're progressing in Milnathort, and then Kinross, I think, was either just after Comrie or third place. But the reality is with all these flood schemes that we're working on, we've got another one to do for Annetty, Burn and Scone that we haven't actually started yet. But the schemes that we're actively working on at the moment, we're pursuing them all at the same time, and it's not a case of us putting Comrie above Kinross or vice versa. We do have staff dedicated to each project, and they're working away as fast as we can, really. But they are, for various reasons that we've explained, they are complex schemes reliant on statutory processes and, most importantly, input from the community. We don't want to impose a scheme on a community that they're not happy with, for one thing. So that does involve a bit of community consultation, and that's still to come. So, yeah, we're pushing these forward as quickly as we can. It's just never going to be, really be as soon or as quick as everybody really needs it to be delivered. But that's unfortunately just the nature of it.
Thanks, Peter. Next question is, why did the council stop dredging the burns? Was it budgets? I know you've maybe mentioned dredging before, Peter, but if you could give us a response to this one.
Yeah, I don't know if I actually recall a time when councils did formally dredge burns. It's not something that councils certainly do now on a routine basis. It is engineered activity. It is licensed by SEPA now. So, and SEPA will grant licenses for that. So it's not necessarily the issue or the perceived issue that SEPA prevent local authorities from dredging or prevent landowners from dredging. That's not the case. It is a licensable, consentable activity on watercourses. But I think, SEPA have responsibilities in terms of flood risk management and environmental management. So I think you have to really demonstrate to SEPA that that is the best sustainable, environmentally advantageous way of managing flooding. And quite often it isn't. What we find with dredging is it's not the best way of dealing with flood risk management for various issues. If you're taking water material out of the bed of a burn or a watercourse, we tend to get instability problems on the watercourse. It can undermine the riverbanks and any riverside walls, bridge abutments, bridge piers, that kind of thing can give you problems. And you do tend to find that the river tends to just try and get back to its natural profile after you've dredged it. So it begins to kind of fight against you almost to return to an equilibrium. So dredging has to be done repeatedly, and that's expensive. So you can spend a lot of time, a lot of activity at quite a high cost and not really getting what you need out of it. Generally what you're trying to do with dredging is, if a watercourse has quite a wide floodplain, and watercourses do connect with a floodplain, and the floodwater spreads over quite a wide area. What you're then trying to do is remove enough material from the bed of the burn to put all that water that otherwise spreads out on the floodplain and constrain it within the channel. So you've got to dredge quite a fair depth to actually do that, to achieve any kind of standard of protection from dredging, and that's really not often feasible. The amount of material we have to remove would give you sort of major instability on the watercourse, and the banks would just collapse. So it's not, it doesn't tend to be a sort of preferred way of dealing with things. We try and sort of work with nature now, work with watercourses a little bit more, and that's why we look at more holistic things. And one other key point is that if you're dredging a watercourse, you can quite often just pass the flood risk on downstream, and that's something we can't really do. You know, if we're dredging to try and protect a certain part of a town or an urban area, we can just be simply passing the flood risk on further downstream. I know it is used, you know, down south quite often in sort of flat floodplain areas, sort of is it South Downs, wherever it is. They have these wide areas of low gradient. And I know they do use dredging, but they do often combine it with other measures. It does often get combined with flood embankments and pumping stations and other engineered measures. So it's kind of horses for courses. It's not something we rule out everywhere. We do look at it in every flood study now. And again, we'll come back to the community with the sort of whys and wherefores and the numbers and the costs, etc. of doing that. But no, I don't think it was stopped because of dredging. You know, the responsibilities do rest with landowners in the first instance, and as I've said, landowners and local authorities can get these licences from SEPA if they can show that that is the best way forward.
Thanks, Peter. A really comprehensive answer. Thank you. Next question relates to sluice gates at Findity, which used to be used to control the levels from the burns in the loch. Why are these not used anymore? Peter, again, is it?
I have to confess, Keith, I don't know about sluice gates at Findity. I would have to look into that one and get back to the respondent. I'm not sure.
Okay, that's one to take away for ourselves.
I have to give you the honest answer, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's a fair point, Peter. Next point is suggesting we're talking about obstruction on the rivers. What about the trees next to the banking and the bridge at South Quay? Surely these are obstructions when the river rises. Peter, sorry, is that one for you again?
Yes. We do carry out a bit of a sort of risk assessment, Keith, when we do these inspections. We do our watercourse assessments, and if we've found that trees have fallen in, for instance, that would be one reason for us to do clearance works. If trees are looking a bit dodgy on the riverbank, they look as if they might fall in, we do clear them, but we will tend to only do that when they have actually created or they're about to create an obstruction. Do often see a lot of vegetation comes up in the summertime, get a lot of calls from residents concerned about that, but you know, if we do have a flood, if it's minor vegetation, it'll just get flattened by the flow and it doesn't actually constitute much of a flood risk, although we will look at the you know, on a case-by-case basis for things like that. So yeah, trees can also help. You've got to bear in mind that you might have you know, some bunch of trees on the riverbank, and they'll actually bind the bank together. The root systems are quite good for giving the bank some integrity, and that's a good thing. We don't want riverbanks to erode, and then we get sediment entering the watercourse and getting washed downstream, and that does create a flood risk. So trees are, you know, can be good and bad. If they fall in, you know, we will clear them. If they're healthy and on the riverbank and not creating an obstruction, we tend to leave them. And there is a bit of thinking now in terms of natural flood management that if you have forest areas, planted areas, they do retain a bit of water, so they retain water up higher up in the catchment, which means the water isn't down in the town where we don't want it. So yeah, you know, trees have a benefit, but we do have to be careful, obviously.
Thanks, Peter. Next question's someone suggesting their father works in the drainage industry all his life. He's spoken to the men from the flood team at PKC, has had meetings with them and a walk around the whole area from the quake right down to the boathouse with the flood team, and told them various things which may help all the residents that are affected by the flooding. But sorry, it seems that it's falling on deaf ears. Understand everyone's working on this, but it's causing so much people anxiety. Totally get the point about the anxiety. I think this may be an individual thing. If the person that's posted this wants to follow that up with us, Obviously, the fact that our team have had conversations with your father and taken time to go up and down the length of the quake, etc., means we are listening. Maybe you're not seeing the fruits of that because, as you said earlier on, Peter, the actual outcome of the flood study hasn't actually come out yet. But if there's any specifics that you feel we're not picking up, then I would suggest if you can use the contact details on your screen, and we can deal with that on an individual basis. Is that okay, Peter? Is there anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I'm just typing out a comment in the chat box. Yeah, any local information from local people is always valued. It's always fed into the investigations and the modelling work that we do. People will have a more formal chance with this to raise all these things again when they see the sort of outline proposals early next year, because we tend to, we'll have to work out how we do this with COVID, but under normal circumstances we would go into a local town hall and put all the plans out and invite everybody in to comment. And we have a lot of local discussions and things at that time. We'll have to find a way of doing that next year, obviously. But local people again will have the chance to get that local knowledge over, which is really important, and we'll get all that fed into the investigation. So it's certainly not falling on deaf ears. We certainly do value that, and we certainly do act on it.
Thanks, Peter. Next question I feel has been covered. It was a question around how much is budget an issue in terms of moving the flood prevention measures forward. But I think, as you said earlier on, Peter, the Kinross scheme is in a good place in terms of Scottish Government funding and Perth and Kinross Council funding. So I'm going to move on from there. I'm conscious of everybody's time. Next comment suggesting that Kinross is number 28 out of 42 on the priority list for the flood scheme. What's the criteria for who gets first priority? Peter, is there any guidance you can give us on that?
Yeah, I'm glad someone's delved that out because I couldn't remember off the top of my head, so I think 28 sounds about right. These were determined back in late 2015, early 2016, just based on whatever local authorities had on the table at that time. SEPA did a big trawl for any flood schemes that local authorities were putting forward, and I think I mentioned earlier on that we do an economic appraisal for flood schemes, so we arrive at a cost benefit ratio based on national guidance. And SEPA just took those cost benefit ratios, and if you had a high cost benefit ratio, you were up the top of the list, and if you're down a bit of a lower one, you're further down the list. To be honest with you, it doesn't really matter because the 42 schemes the government has committed to funding those, they're all getting funded, so it doesn't matter if you're number 1 or you're number 42, you're getting capital grant through, and it's just up to the local authority to just progress the scheme, and that is what's happening. So don't get too tied up on the priorities. What might happen in future cycles of the flood risk management plans, because they're done on a 6-yearly cycle, is that if we have a situation where there's more flood schemes than the government can fund, and I don't think within that situation the government might have to say, well, we'll fund X number of schemes and the rest will be in a subsequent cycle. That might have to happen. We're certainly not in that boat yet, but that's what's getting worked on at the moment in terms of the new flood risk management plans. SEPA have got a new process now where they prioritise them, so it's not just about cost benefit ratio, it's not just purely based on the sort of degree of flood risk and the economic cost of a scheme. There's a whole other range of factors come into it now, including things like natural flood management and a whole other host of factors that I won't go into. It's a much more holistic process, and the priority scores and the priority rankings won't necessarily go to those flood schemes that have got the highest cost benefit ratio. There might be schemes who they get up the priority list because of other factors, but in terms of South Kinross, don't worry about that because you're already you're already getting capital grant funding, so that's not really a concern going forward.
Okay, cheers, Peter. I'm conscious of time, so the next point's quite lengthy. I'm going to try and summarise it by suggesting that the issues around sandbags and availability of sandbags in August, and is there an opportunity to have a sandbag store somewhere in Kinross, because at the depot there were none available, although Stuart's put in the chat this was a waste depot, not necessarily a roads depot, and the person putting in the comment in the chat is suggesting somewhere in High Street in Kinross. And as we've said earlier on, there is a kind of community stock in Milner Thought, and we'd be more than happy to work with the Kinross residents for a community stock in Kinross as well. So again, if we can kind of take that away from this discussion and have further conversations about local community resilience around that, I think that would be most welcome, and we'd more than happy to support that. Next question from Richard Waters. Would it be possible to look at the drain clearing schedule in areas that have repeat flooding? Stuart's responding, it's a widespread issue and could result in more places being put on an additional clearance than we have the resource to manage. Also in flood events, very often the issue with the pipework or watercourse that the drain goes into, and so the increased clearing of the gully pot wouldn't necessarily add capacity or resilience. So I think, as you said earlier on, Stuart, sometimes it's to do with the pipe, not necessarily the gully pot. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the case. I mean, we could go and cleanse gullies today, and a flood event could happen tomorrow. And if the pipework runs to capacity, the drain won't function any better than it would have done if we hadn't cleaned it. Obviously, if it's sitting full of silt up to the top, it doesn't work effectively, even in light rain. And we try to avoid that where we can. But it doesn't necessarily improve lower the risk of flooding hugely in an event like we had in August.
Okay, thanks, Stuart. This next comment relates to in reference to not having time when the burn floods to put up sandbag walls at the burn. Why don't we put up sandbags at the point where the burns have already been breached when it's not flooding? I know you kind of half answered that before, Peter. Do you want to say a bit more on that one?
Yeah, the problem with flooding, as we find, is difficult. We don't really know while we get warnings, etc. It's difficult to be specific. So Stuart and try to do his sandbag response or his flood response could be looking at dozens of locations, and we just simply don't have the resources to be building sandbag walls everywhere, and that requires a reasonable amount of flood warning as well, which we don't always get. A lot of flooding in Perth and Kinross is very flashy and just happens. There just isn't really the time, unfortunately, all the resources. We have simply just have too many locations where flooding can potentially occur to really be doing this. I think it's Stuart alluded to earlier on, we get a lot of yellow warnings coming out, which don't amount to anything. And we just don't have the resources to really be responding and putting out quite extensive measures when we get so many of these, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks, Peter.
Keith, I would just say as well, it could also lead to a degree to false insecurity. If we were to do that 2 years ago and there was no flooding until February and again August this year, by then the sandbags could have deteriorated and might not be efficient or effective, and could actually wash into the watercourse or be pushed into the watercourse by folk out and about. So it could lead to as much problems as it might look to resolve. Okay,
thanks for that, Stuart. I'm looking at the time, and what I would ask Bobby and colleagues to do is, in view of the scheduled time for this meeting, I'd ask Bobby to kind of close off the questions at 8 o'clock. So if you have any final questions, if I could ask you to put them in, we will deal with the remaining questions if we go over time beyond 8 o'clock. I'm sure my colleagues will be more than happy to answer the questions, but I think what we'll do is close the questions down by 8. So if there's any sort of final questions people have want to raise with ourselves, then please feel free to do so. Next question relates to, I find it hard to understand why it's taken since 2016 to do the study, then a further 3 years to implement the measures. It sounds like manpower is an issue. Peter, do you want to come in on that one?
Flood schemes, to give you a general guide, it's 10 years really from the time we start doing the sort of initial feasibility study work to getting the scheme on the ground, and that's fairly common with if you speak to most local authorities who've done these kind of projects, they'll tell you that sometimes it takes longer. Unfortunately, there's been examples where they've been done a little bit quicker than that, but it's just the number of steps that we have to go through from doing the initial study, which then kind of justifies the business case, if you like, to get the money. A lot of work has to go into the study. And we then move through various stages of feasibility work into outline design and then detailed design, tendering, and then actually getting a contractor to build. The scheme can take, typically a couple of years. So the whole process does take quite a lot of time. It's not really down to manpower. It's just down to the complexity, and flooding is a sort of multidisciplinary, multi-agency task. So we do work with the community, obviously, first and foremost, but we're working with SEPA, Scottish Water, and a number of other parties in these projects, and we're feeding information through them, getting approval for, it might be licenses or statutory consents. When we do come to get the statutory approval for the flood scheme, we have to publish it, and people can object to it. Quite often the objections take time. There's a legal process there. It takes time to resolve that, and that can delay schemes. And again, just the amount of other work that we're doing, a number of other schemes and flood studies. Unfortunately, we can't just focus on Kinross, although it is a bit of a priority for us. We've got staff working on projects and studies, as well as watercourse clearance works. We give advice to planning in terms of flood risk. We look at something like 400 planning applications a year. So our team does do a lot of work. We're very busy. And unfortunately, we can't just deliver these projects as quickly as we might like. So yeah, it's not just as simple as saying it's a manpower issue. It's a bit more complicated than that, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Next contact suggested phoned the council with regard to getting sandbags, was told they wouldn't be provided unless flooding was imminent, and saying, in all truth, if flooding is imminent, by the time we get these and deploy them, it's already much too late. Stuart was saying, in response, this is generally because it's a widespread event. We're diverted to so many areas. It is already an imminent issue, so can't go to numerous calls when we get them. It might cause concern. The increased incidence in Creek Place, however, has raised our awareness, as was the case on Saturday afternoon evening when we dispatched a lorry with sandbags prior to any actual flooding. So what I think we're suggesting, Stuart, is about being sort of preemptive. And as you were obviously proactive on Saturday, when obviously there was very heavy rainfall, and as we've talked about before, the opportunity for community sandbag storage, etc., might be the way ahead in terms of that, rather than the point at which the flood water's rising and you guys are pulled in a dozen different directions, because that's just going to be practically not really possible to support at that point in time.
Yeah, that's the issue, and if we can get a store out there, then all the good. But as I said, we did go out there Saturday afternoon when there was concerns raised by the residents, and I don't think they were realised, thankfully, but we did attend on the basis that it has been an increased incidence of flooding in that area.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. And sorry, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. It's just on a related subject. Somebody saying perhaps give residents themselves enough sandbags to build the wall when the burn is at risk of flooding. Again, we'd want to work with the communities around the sandbag provision proactively, so that communities can support themselves. Yeah,
we can't do that. The only issue we get is that predominantly it's the owner's responsibility to protect their property themselves. So if you know you're at risk, like Peter said, you should be taking maybe some measures in advance. And I know that's maybe sounds a bit harsh, but if you know your property is at risk, and sandbags are readily available to purchase, so it is within folks' gift to get sandbags delivered and do something themselves, have a little store kept themselves. But we will look to work with communities to provide sandbags where we can. Yeah.
Thanks, Stuart. Next question, and this has been quite a kind of common question around a lot of the sessions that we've had, suggesting that building more houses in Kinross is a contributory factor to the water levels. Is the drainage required for these developments impacting on this? And would this be part of a study? And James has helpfully put in an answer that we have guidance for developers on what conditions they have to satisfy for planning. The development must include something called sustainable urban drainage systems, so that there's no additional water running off the site than would have been the case before the development, and then we check evidence of that the developers provide this. So yeah, new housing schemes or new schemes such as this would not be impose additional water runoff because of the sustainable urban drainage system. Next comment, this goes back to talking about dredging the burns. The caller suggesting the council did use to dredge the burns. They weren't the floods. There weren't floods when this happened. I think, as you maybe mentioned, Peter, that kind of predates your involvement in the council. So I don't know if anybody's in a position to even comment on that, because that could be a long time ago, and but it's not within our memories of that taking place.
I'm not sure about Kinross, Keith, but we have looked into flood records in other areas where, you know, there might have been dredging activity, but there was still flooding is the conclusion of that. I think flooding's always been with us. I think, you know, it's probably getting worse. We're seeing it more frequently, probably due to climate change, we're guessing, but you know, it has always been a problem. I don't think it's as simple as just saying that when we used to dredge there was no flooding, therefore I don't think it's quite as simple as that. But you know, we would have to look at records, etc., to arrive at that conclusion for Kinross, I think.
Okay, thanks very much, Peter. I think that comes to the conclusion of all the questions and comments, and we're so grateful to residents, so grateful to elected members for taking time out this evening to listen to the presentation, give us your comments and questions. They're really valuable. As I said earlier on, there will be a record of tonight's discussions on YouTube. We will take a note of the questions and have answers for them. In concluding tonight's proceedings, just want to say huge thank you to council colleagues, particularly Peter, who seemed to get the majority of the questions. Peter, always the way. But also grateful thanks to Mike Runge from Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, from Carol from Scottish Flood Forum, from other council colleagues, and thanks very much for all your contributions this evening, and hopefully you'll enjoy the rest of your evening. I should also say, if there are any follow-ups to anybody, the information is on the screen, so if you have any questions that weren't answered tonight, then please feel free to do so. But other than that, have an enjoyable evening. Thank you.